Let me now turn to an iconic word in American politics that surprisingly is found nowhere in the three immigration reports, and that word is diversity. Now, diversity has become, for those who believe that the encouragement and accommodation of difference reflects the best traditions of this country, that has become a driving force for fairness arguments in domestic policy. And yet, paradoxically, we don't see any question of immigration diversity in any of the three task force reports. And they all three strenuously avoid, and I just can't think it's accidental that they would ignore this sort of obvious thing that they all must know about, the growing imbalance among ethnic, cultural, and linguistic groups in the United States, which is a direct result of family preference categories and past legalizations. And the additional legalization of 10 to 12 million new illegal immigrants would, in fact, just exacerbate that problem. Now, when you have very large numbers of one cultural or linguistic group, it creates incentives for such groups, or more accurately, their self-appointed advocates, to press for the accommodation of their assimilation preferences and to get more political clout. And, you know, it gives rise to what I call the politics of fright. We were talking outside, and Mark was just on a program with a representative of the Center for American Progress, thank you. And they were talking about the DREAM Act, but her final words were really telling, you know, Hispanics will be watching, you know, they're going to get you if you don't do that. And of course, the worst example of that, one of the worst episodes in the Obama presidency, in my view, is when he called on Hispanics to punish their enemies. And it's that kind of divisive racial and ethnic rhetoric that gets revved up when people start to appeal to groups on the basis of their ethnic composition rather than on the basis of their identity as Americans. And my point here is that, you know, American immigration policy takes in immigrants from over 200 countries and territories. And so it's diverse in that way. But it is, in some respects, a very shallow diversity. We have many more from small groups of people than we do from the larger group. Now, you know, maybe because it's because I'm an only child, and maybe because, you know, I'm, you know, a moderate right person in a academic world of, you know, less than moderate leftists. I know that just raising this issue is going to be a difficult one. You know, immigrants living in the United States, you know, are going to, you know, respond to this. They want to have large numbers of their own group. Large numbers attract political attention and efforts on the to further the group's preferences and so forth. And I understand that, but we've got to find a way, I think, to talk to such groups to try to talk about America's national interest rather than the interest of one particular group. I thought I've only found one quote by somebody that I would call mainstream in the New York Times sense of mainstream, and it's a column by you know, it's a narrow band, Mark. It's a column by a man who I think is a pretty fair, is a very good thinker. He's he's good, Ross Dohat. Who supports, by the way, higher levels of legal immigration, but also workplace enforcement. And in a pretty stunning op-ed piece, he writes a column. Here's what he said, and I think it's worth mentioning. He said, in a better world, the United States would welcome legal immigrants from a much wider array of countries. A more diverse immigrant population would have fewer opportunities for self-segregation and stronger incentives to assimilate. Fears of a Spanish-speaking reconquista would diminish, and so would the likelihood of backlash. And instead of being heavily skilled towards low-skilled immigrants, our system could tilt towards higher-skilled applicants, making America more competitive and less stratified. Such a system would also be fairer to the would-be immigrants themselves. It's a point that is rarely heard on the other side of the ledger. America has always prided itself on attracting people from every culture, continent, and creed. In a globalized world, aspiring Americans in Zimbabwe or Burma would compete on a level playing field with Mexicans and Salvadorians. Now, diversity in our immigration system is important in and of itself, but it's even more important when assimilation or integration, as I prefer, itself comes under pressure. And all three task forces recommend increasing the efforts to make immigrants more a part of the American national community. And they are efforts which I have supported for many years and which I have written about and which I think are very important for us to do. But there's a lot that we might have to worry a bit about, and I quote several studies in the paper, and I'll just give you the flavor of one here briefly, which is the 2009 Pew Hispanic study of what it called millennials. These are three-generation people who, come here, just come here. People have a parent who come, and then people who have both parents who have come here. And the point is, how do they identify themselves? And the answer is that after, 3 generations here, 48% identify themselves by their country of origin, that's not the United States, or the term Hispanic. That to me is a troubling statistic because it shows that while people may be integrated instrumentally here, that is, they may own homes, they have bank accounts and so forth, it's the emotional attachment part of it that doesn't seem to be getting as much traction. And further, the study suggests that in these families, there's much more of a likelihood that the parents are talking with pride about their home country and much less with pride about their American country. And not surprisingly, if you know anything about political socialization studies, which I used to do some of when I was younger, the family impact has a big impact on kids' attitudes. If the family is saying, look back to your home country and speak Spanish, don't worry too much about what's here, kids are going to take the cue, and it turns up in their data, and that's true. Lastly, last point. Let me take a look at the political context of these blue ribbon panels, which are odd ducks, sort of like the lame ducks, but just odd ducks. These are panels that are hip, eye deep in politics. They speak of themselves as being independent experts, and they are experts, and I think they are, but in many, many ways, they are creatures of politics. Their institutions, for example, are in the business of conventional wisdom that will become law. You couldn't get joined at the hip with the political process any more than that. I'm not saying they sell themselves out in any way. It's not my point at all. But they narrow the band of what they look like. They recruit people on the basis of that narrow band. And by what they look at and what they don't look at and who they have and who they don't have and the agreements that come to bear before people sign on, everybody signs on to a good faith agreement to reach common ground, and they try, and they generally do that. All of these panels suggest that we ought to take the politics out of immigration studies, but they present what, to me, is a laughable idea. What they want to set up are independent, in quotes, panels or to report to commissions. The MPI wants a standing commission on immigration and the labor market. The Brookings-Duke institution wants an independent commission on immigration, which would answer, every immigration question. They had social scientists, economic people, and so forth. But the bottom line of all this is that these groups would be tasked with presenting to Congress every 2 years a report telling them what the immigration levels ought to be of skilled labor or unskilled labor. Now just think about that for a minute. Just give that a moment in your mind. What has happened before in the United States is that we have periods where there's a big buildup of energy and commotion for getting some kind of immigration policy, and we get, something like IRCA. IRCA's passed, 2.8 million illegal immigrants become legal. We have the residue of that, and pretty soon we've got backlogs, we've got more people coming into the country. Consternation begins to develop. People want to have more and more new immigration policy. That builds up, and we get to the point in 2007, many, many years later, when we build up to a crescendo and it crashes. That's been the history of immigration reform. Now just imagine, Congress meets every 2 years. We re-elect a new Congress. So every 2 years, what we're going to do is to throw into the political hopper a charged account. Well, we ought to have this many immigrants, we ought to have that many immigrants, we ought to have this many skilled workers, we ought to have that many non-skilled workers. It's a recipe for total political disaster. And I don't think it's an idea that's very good from the standpoint of the ongoing emotional health of the American public. I don't mean that as an analyst, I just mean that as a political scientist. I take up inside this report the various ways in which the staffing ideas for this, really are not too well thought out. One of the groups wants to have an odd number of people, and that way, you'll have a majority. Well, a 4-3 recommendation is not going to buy much legitimacy. And another one says, well, the legitimacy of these independent-minded people will be, we'll have Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And Hans, you know more about this than I do, but I do know a little bit about the Civil Rights Commission, which over the last couple of years has been a policy disaster with people, at each other's throats, contrivances to get so-called independence on the commission. These commissions will not remove politics from the immigration process. What they will do, and what I am very much against, is that they will remove the voice of the American people from making immigration reform. And I'll end by making this observation, which is that one of the things about the last election, the midterm election, that I find really reassuring about the United States is that for the first time in a long while, ordinary Americans, I was out to dinner last night with somebody we were talking about immigration, and I reminded him, there's a lot of America in between Washington and San Francisco. It's a lot of people live out there in between, and they have spoken up strongly and uniformly in a way which I think personally is very good for the country. And so to remove them from the process and to hand that process to the very people who got us into these jams in the first place strikes me as poor policy and a very bad idea. And on that note,